Good evening. We are going to continue our study in Proverbs tonight. We had left off last week in Proverbs chapter 9, so we are going to be picking up in Proverbs chapter 10 this evening. Hope that you guys are doing well. We had the slightest bit of mishap yesterday. We had our first opportunity to meet back at the building over at Happy Hill, and Brittany and I both forgot what time we normally left for services, and both had planned to leave much later than we had actually needed to leave, so we ended up having to scrap our dinner plans and hop in the car almost immediately once we realized what time it is. It was really nice getting to meet back with them. I'm hoping that someday soon we will get to meet back at our building on Colonial, and we can resume our study in 1 Corinthians. But for now, we're going to make do with what we have, and we are going to continue our study here in Proverbs. So up through chapter 9, we had a narrative where Solomon is convincing his readers, his audience, to be individuals who desire wisdom, who seek it, who treasure it in their hearts, and then to diligently apply it to their lives. And then starting here in chapter 10 is where we have there in verse 1, the Proverbs of Solomon, where you have those 2 to 3 line statements, sometimes contrasting, sometimes building on one another. And I've struggled to try to figure out how to go through this. Almost every other class you go through, there's a narrative to follow inside of the scriptures. So if you are going through the Kings, you build the narrative of the divided kingdom, and you start working through northern kings, southern kings, time periods of restoration, time periods of rebellion. You have battles that are fought and won. There are all kinds of things to follow in a narrative. Same thing goes with pretty much any other book. You can talk about history and background and context. But Proverbs are not exactly like that. There's a bit of a challenge to it. A challenge in the sense that there isn't this same narrative that's going to be flowing through chapter 10. Up through chapter 9, we had a narrative to follow. We had a drive. But starting at chapter 10 are these seemingly disconnected 2 or 3 line statements that do not fit into an overall context, seemingly, and do not form a story, but are little bits of wisdom and hints on how to live properly. Wisdom, as we have been talking about, is the ability or the skill to live righteously. There is a big difference between having knowledge of something and having wisdom on how to apply that. So what Solomon does is he takes all of the knowledge from the Old Testament law, and he then puts it into practical ways for us to memorize them, us to have them pop into our heads in various situations in our life. So we'll give you a for instance that's not in our topic tonight, which is chapter 11, verse 1, that a false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. There is a larger context back in Leviticus chapter 19 that deals with false balances and false weights. Now, that is an important aspect of the Old Testament law. Part of what Solomon is doing here in chapter 11, verse 1, is he is giving them that law in a very short time frame, in a very short sentence, so that they can remember that. He's not only referring to false balances, he's dealing there with a larger aspect of having proper dealings, business dealings, of being upright in our dealings in our businesses. And so what he does is he both summarizes an Old Testament law in a way that's easy to memorize. He then imparts larger wisdom that is entailed inside those small statements, and he packages them all up in a way that we can memorize them, and whenever we are in a situation, that statement can come to mind. And so what you have from chapters 10 through the rest of the book is a whole series of these statements that seemingly don't have a lot of a context to them. All of that is to say that it's been challenging for me to figure out how do I teach this in a setting without having to go through or without getting to go through a context. I know many other people have taken Proverbs and they have broken it apart into themes, and they have pulled out a verse here or 2 or 3 verses there and tied it together to teach on the wisdom of how to speak properly, not enunciation and diction, but of propriety, of not gossiping, purity of speech, speaking righteousness, those things. And have also lumped together a whole bunch of other topics and have almost categorized Proverbs themselves and then go through that theme by theme. That isn't a terrible way, and I don't want to criticize individuals who have done that, and I don't intend to say that they've done a terrible job with that. But as I have wrestled with how to move through Proverbs, one of the things that I have been considering over the last couple of weeks thinking about it is what Solomon says at the end of Ecclesiastes. Solomon makes the point that he has spent a lot of his time both writing and arranging the Proverbs, so that he has put a structure and a format to them that is according to the wisdom that God gave him, and they are laid out here for us in this order. So what I would really like to do is just kind of go chapter by chapter. There are some themes that are repeated, and I'll try to make note of some of those things as we go through chapter 10. I hope that it doesn't become repetitive. I hope that it doesn't become disjointed in our minds. But there is some actual context in which these are placed. While you have one statement that seems to lead to another statement that isn't fully connected, I believe that there is overall themes inside of Proverbs. The more you spend time with them, the more I believe that you get to understand the context in which they're written. So what we'll do is we'll take some time kind of piece by piece. We're not going to read the entire chapter together at the start. We're just going to go kind of verse by verse or section by section if we can. So starting there in verse 1, the Proverbs of Solomon, a wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. This is an oft-repeated theme through the entire book, and sometimes it acts as a header for other sections of the book. Chapter 17, verse 25, chapter 29, verse 3, and chapter 29, verse 13 all have very similar statements that a wise son makes his father glad and a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. Part of what he's hoping to get across to us is the wisdom that we exhibit in our lives, or the foolishness that we exhibit in our lives, is not self-contained, is not simply something that's either for us or conversely against us. This is something that has spreading ramifications on other people as well. Most directly here, he's dealing with a son to his parents. The same thing is going to apply when it comes to a wife and her husband. And the same thing is going to apply for a parent and their children, or members of society to other members of society. He's hoping for us to realize that our actions are not truly and fully our own. That is a pretty common theme whenever it comes to people justifying themselves and how they act in today's society. To say that, I'm not hurting anyone else, I'm not doing this against anybody. But Solomon kind of categorizes this as the very beginning of this section, as well as a number of other sections, that the way that you act, either in wisdom or in foolishness, will have a large impact on other people in your life as well. And sometimes we like to minimize the effect that we have on others in our minds because we don't like the guilt that we feel over harming others or leading other people astray. And yet that is the exact sentiment that he has at the very end of this chapter, is that you end up leading other people astray by our actions. And so we'll talk about that as we get further on down. So he tells us there in verse 2, treasure gained by wickedness does not profit, but righteousness delivers from death. One of the things that you see is an interconnection between a lot of the other passages in the Bible, either furthering in teaching or examples of this wisdom being played out in real life. I apologize. And in Ezekiel chapter 7 is one of those instances where Ezekiel talks about people who threw their gold and their silver out in the street, hoping that would save them, but it was far too late. The righteous, they were not delivered through their gold and their silver. It didn't profit them in the end. but the righteous are delivered from death. It contrasts Ezekiel with Daniel, for instance. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all individuals who were saved precisely through their righteousness. We do see a lot of times where righteous people die, but again, this statement still holds true that the righteous are delivered from the second death. Consider it that way as well. As you move over into verse 3, what I had done in preparation for the study tonight is, as you guys know, I like to mark up my Bible quite extensively. And as I started working through this chapter and underlining certain things, I realized that some of them repeated through the chapter. That's what I mean by that there is some of a context here in chapter 10. In fact, all of Proverbs, there is going to be kind of a larger paragraph, if you will, that these fit into, where he will repeat a theme and will build on one statement to another. So that as you understand one proverb more, that would help to understand another one as well. And hopefully I'll be able to point out some of those here in chapter 10. As a complete side note, if you are someone who enjoys an electronic Bible, I'm going to pick on you just for a moment and just advocate for a paper Bible. Sometimes it is hard to pick up these repeating themes and patterns if you are only looking at one or two verses at a time on a small screen. If you have an entire Bible laid out for you, you are able to make those connections maybe a little bit easier. Or at least for my mind, that is certainly the case. I thoroughly enjoy my electronic Bible, but when it comes to study, I really cannot replace a paper Bible just for the way that my mind works. So what I had done is I started underlining sections here in one color and realized that those themes run throughout the rest of the chapter, and then follow that up with the same color under that theme. And so I'll try to point out some of those as we go through chapter 10 together. Here in verse 3, the Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. This is where we get into some of the truisms of Proverbs. Jesus makes the point that during the time period of Elijah, and that 3.5 years where he prayed that there be no rain until he prayed again, that there was a massive famine in the land. And yet Elijah went to only one widow, and she was not an Israelite. And you ask, well, how is it that during that 3.5 year time period that they went hungry? And yet it says here that the righteous do not go hungry. One of the things we can consider is, was Israel righteous at that time? And the widow that Elijah did go to, was she not a righteous individual? Jesus further teaches on this in Matthew chapter 6 and in verse 33. Seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, and then all of these things will be added to you. And he mentions here also in verse 3 that he thwarts the craving of the wicked. Now, Solomon wrestles with this in the book of Ecclesiastes, that it seems that some people perish in the midst of their good pursuits, and the wicked go from bad to worse. He is stating here uncategorically here in chapter 10 that God is going to eventually deal with their cravings and eventually answer them in righteousness. He's going to give justice to those who do unrighteousness. He then gets into a couple other things that help explain the previous verse in verse 3. This is what I mean. So let's take verse 4, for instance, that a slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. Now, those two things do not seem maybe on the surface to go hand in hand. But I want us to consider what he is saying here in the overall context of Proverbs. Remember what we dealt with over in 1 Thessalonians. In 1 Thessalonians, you have a group of Christians who are fairly new, and they believe, or they have been taught incorrectly by somebody, or they have come to the assumption somehow that the second coming of Jesus was going to be relatively soon. If you think that next month that you are the world is going to end, you're going to be caught up into the clouds with Jesus in his second return, what would be the point of you going to the job that you hate and working diligently to make more money than you need for this month? Consequently, what that has led to in Thessalonica was a bunch of people who decided that they weren't going to work on the hopes that Jesus was going to come soon. And Paul admonished them both with his own example and direct commands from God for us to be people who are diligent in our work, that we are going to be people who are productive members of society, that we are going to provide for ourselves, provide for our families, that we are going to work hard, laboring with our own hands so that we can give generously to anybody who is in need. All of that fits into God's plan for us as mankind. Now, consider that in the context of verse 3, that the Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, along with verse 4, that a slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. He who gathers in summer is prudent, but he who sleeps in the harvest is a son who brings shame, in verse 5. That those two ideas seem to be going hand in hand, that righteousness is going to be tied with us not being a sluggard or us not being slothful. The very famous command in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 that if man does not work, neither let him eat. That's 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. Is given over to Christians. That's their role, is that if you are claiming to be a Christian and not working, then food is not something that the church should continue to provide to you, or Christians should not continue to provide to you. So he's tying these ideas together in verse 3, 4, and 5, that being righteous goes hand in hand with being diligent in verse 4, and gathering in summer in verse 5. So while we have three different proverbs that are somewhat seemingly disconnected, they all fit together quite nicely. Here in verse 6, blessings are on the head of the righteous, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. This is a phrase that is going to come up again here in verse 11. But the idea of what is in the mouth of the righteous and what is in the mouth of the wicked, that is going to be a theme that runs throughout chapter 10. And those ideas build on one another. So blessings are in the head of the righteous, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. Well, how does it happen? We'll get into that in a couple more verses. Verse 7, the memory of the righteous is a blessing, but the name of the wicked will rot. Chapter 22 and verse 11 has a very similar statement, as well as chapter 7 and in verse 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 1. Think of people that you dearly love, people who have good reputations. That's what 22 and verse 1 deals with, that a good name is better than ointment, Ecclesiastes 7 verse 1. Whenever you think back fondly on those people, or whenever you think back on them, do you think back fondly with them? There may be an ache in your heart that they're no longer with you, that you don't get to talk to them, maybe that there's questions that you never got to ask. But that feeling is completely different from those who, in your past, who have done you harm, who have wronged you in some way. There are names that live in infamy in history, and there are names that are upheld for generations to come as a positive thing. The names of Martin Luther King and Benedict Arnold are not the same thing in our minds. And that's what he's dealing with. That the memory of the righteous is a blessing. That being reminded of them is a good thing to those who remember them in the future. But the name of the wicked will rot. He then gets into verse 8. The wise of heart will receive commandments, but a babbling fool will come to ruin. Again, another phrase that's repeated here in chapter 10, that babbling fool. When it comes to how we conduct our speech, that is one of the first things that Solomon is talking about here in Proverbs. Now, one of the great things about Proverbs is, as we mentioned before, as we looked in chapter 11, verse 1, with the false weights and just dealings, while that is specifically dealing with false weights, the larger application is business practice as a whole. One of the great things about Proverbs is that we get to look at these statements and reason them out together, and that kind of reinstills some of that wisdom together. So that the wise of heart will receive commandments, but a babbling fool will come to ruin. What is it that a righteous person or a wise person does with his mouth? Well, here in chapter 10, Solomon has a lot to say about it. One of them is that the wise of heart will receive commandments, and the other one is that the mouth of a fool is going to bring him to ruin in verse 8. And we'll pick up on some of these themes down in verse 10, as we get down into verse 18, 19, and verse 23. All of these verses are going to go hand in hand to talk about what the mouth does. In fact, he goes right into it again in verse 11, that the mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. Again, the same phrase we saw back in verse 6. The blessings are the head of the righteous, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. Verse 11, the same thing. The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life. I want us to consider this in the context of chapter 27 and verse 6. Proverbs 27 and in verse 6, Solomon says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend, profuse are the kisses of an enemy." What Solomon is dealing with here, both in chapter 10 and in chapter 27, is the end consequences of what we say. Solomon says in chapter 27 that it is the wounds of a friend are faithful. Consider that in the context of verse 11 of chapter 10, that the mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life. Jesus says that his words are spirit and life. That there are some times where we're going to have to confront somebody, a friend, with things that they don't want to hear. He tells us back in verse 6 he tells us here in verse 8 that the heart of the wise will receive a commandment. And sometimes the world will hate us for that. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but not everybody wants those wounds. Not everyone is willing to accept those. He mentions them as a category of fools, or the unrighteous do not want to hear that. But the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. How does he conceal it? Well, chapter 27, as we read already, there in verse 6, he says, "Profuse are the kisses of an enemy." If I just applaud somebody for their unrighteousness, if I congratulate them and encourage them in the sins that they're already committing, am I not concealing harm to them? If I lavish them with kisses, but in the end I help them on their path to death and destruction, am I really being a friend? And that's what Solomon is really encouraging us to look. We're on both sides of this coin. We're on the side of the one who speaks or conceals violence, or we're also on the side of one who receives the wounds and the kisses of an enemy. And he is encouraging us in Proverbs to look at both sides of that. When it comes to us as the speaker, do we tend to conceal things to save someone's feelings or to save our relationship with them? Or do we speak the truth to them, even if it hurts, knowing that the mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life? That's an important question for us as the speaker. Now, when it comes to us as the listener, do we tend to gravitate to only people who give us lavish praise for the choices that we make? Or do we tend to look at people who are going to have a mouth that is a fountain of life, even if they wound us from time to time? This is what we're talking about when it comes to the skill or the art of living righteously, is looking at these proverbs and figuring out for ourselves, who are we? Where are we? And if we're in the wrong position, if we're not the right kind of people, how do we change? Who do we look towards to help us? And that is what we're talking about here in chapter 10, that the mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life. And sometimes that includes harming someone, not physically harming them, but directing them away from their current choices, because those current choices lead them to death and destruction. We, by our words, can lead someone to life. We can use our words, our mouth, as a fountain of life. Or we can conceal the violence that is inside of their sinful actions by lavishing praise and just cajoling them and congratulating them on their bravery. Those are very different things. One looks very productive. One looks very loving and kind. The other one can look very harsh and degrading. It can look unloving. But Solomon says this is where wisdom comes in, and knowing if it's a faithful wound of a friend or if it's a kiss that is lavished by an enemy. And we need to ask ourselves where we are. And so he says here in verse 11, the mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. He mentions here in verse 12, hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all offenses. Solomon later categorizes something very similar when he talks about how hatred stirs up strife. He mentions in the context of how a pressed nose will bleed and how someone who is angry will stir up with their words more heat. So here he mentions hatred stirs up strife. Titus chapter 3, I think, is a good example in verse 10, where he talks about someone who inside the church who causes division, who stirs up division, stirs up strife, after warning them once and twice, have nothing more to do with them. When we're looking at the category of someone who is loving, characteristics of a Christian, sometimes people will stir up strife in the guise of truly, I'm being loving by stirring up the strife. Well, again, we're going to be looking at the balance of verse 11. The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life. But when does that turn into stirring up strife? That is going to be an important question to know. There's some point in time where we have to recognize that strife is caused by hatred. And there's a difference between someone who faithfully wounds a friend out of love to correct them onto the path, and the person who loves to stir up strife. And that is not a loving person in verse 12. That is someone who is motivated by hatred. And then in verse 12, he also concludes that love covers all offenses. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 8, James chapter 5 as well, both deal with the fact that love covers a multitude of sins. The phrase that's very famous from 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and in verse 7, where he mentions that love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. The idea of love believing all things is very close to the phrasing that's used here, that love covers offenses. Instead of airing laundry that has been already washed, probably not the best way to phrase that, if I have a problem with you and I go and talk to you privately about that, and that problem is resolved, then there's no reason for us to talk about it anymore. There's no reason for me to air that before anybody else. And so that's what he's speaking of here, that love covers all offenses. Once those are over, then they're over. There's no reason for me to cause strife over that matter. And those are two different ways of handling things. One is motivated by hatred, who stirs up strife. One is motivated by love, that covers up offenses, does not conceal violence, but it covers up past offenses that have already been resolved. Moving on to verse 13, on the lips of him who has understanding, wisdom is found, but the rod is for the back of him who lacks sense. Again, we're comparing and contrasting the things, the fruit of the lips, what comes out of your mouth. Is it something that covers up violence, covers up sin that's in people's lives? Or is it wisdom is found on your lips? Verse 14, let's look at verses 14 through 17. I think all of these kind of go together. I have all of them underlined in the same colors. The wise lay up knowledge, but the mouth of a fool brings ruin near. A rich man's wealth is in his strong city. The poverty of a fool is in their ruin. The wages of the righteous leads to life. The gain of the wicked is sin. Whoever heeds instruction is on the path to life, but he who rejects reproof leads others astray. So if you look at the first line from each of these four verses, the wise lay up knowledge, a rich man's wealth is his strong city, The wages of the righteous leads to life, and whoever heeds instructions is on the path to life. I think all four of those statements build a larger view of this. So the wise lay up knowledge. And then that explains, verse 15, that a rich man's wealth is his strong city. Now, what wealth is he speaking of here in verse 15? Is he speaking of gold and silver, or is he speaking of that treasure that Solomon has been encouraging us this entire book to view as treasure? Truly treasure, and for us to recognize it as treasure. The wise lay up knowledge in verse 14. And a rich man's wealth is a strong city. And the wages of the righteous lead to life. Whoever heeds instructions on the path of life. I think all four of those ideas go together to give you a larger, better picture of who this person is. That they're going to lay up knowledge. That it's going to be a strong city to them. That the wages of righteousness lead to life. And the way that you get those wages of righteousness is that you heed instruction that puts you on that path of life. So you see how all four of those ideas work together. Now, the converse of all four of those ideas also go together. That the mouth of a fool brings ruin near. Notice how he contrasts that in verse 14. That the wise lay up knowledge. As James talks about, be quick to hear, slow to speak. And we're going to see that theme here in chapter 10 as well. The more that comes out of the mouth, the more transgression comes as well. The more foolishness comes as well. So the wise lay up knowledge, but the mouth of the fool brings him to ruin. The poverty of the poor is their ruin. The gain of the wicked, of the wicked to sin. But he who rejects reproof leads others astray. All of those ideas together. So I don't think verse 15 is inherently talking about financial wealth. I think he's dealing there with wisdom wealth. Wealth and wisdom and poverty and wisdom. Since it's the fool who brings ruin near in verse 14. Verse 15, the poverty of the poor is their ruin. I don't think Solomon is saying, well, if you're poor, lack of money is the thing that really ruined you. This is in the context of those four verses, that the poverty is that they have never treasured wisdom. They never stored up knowledge. And therefore, that makes them poor in knowledge. And that is their ruin. And that leads in verse 16 to sin. And whenever you reject that knowledge, not only does it affect you, as we talked about back in verse 1, but it leads other people astray. There's a reason that when we go over 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and Paul deals with the idea of church discipline, that he tells you to remove the leaven from the lump, lest the whole lump be leavened. That one person who is walking astray has a tendency to lead other people astray. 1 Corinthians 15, do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good morals. And how many people are the people who think, well, my friends are not going to be the ones who do that. I'm going to be the stronger of all of us, and I'm going to lead all of them not astray. He deals with that here. If you reject reproof, you lead other people astray. In verse 18, the one who conceals hatred has lying lips. Whoever utters slander is a fool. And so you read the first statement of verse 18, that whoever conceals hatred has lying lips. Well, then I should voice my hatred loudly. Well, he deals with that in the later part of verse 18. Whoever utters slander is a fool. Obviously the point that Jesus makes in Matthew chapter 5 is that hatred should not be in our hearts. Concealed or spoken, that's the point. But if you harbor that, then you have lying lips. But whoever utters slander is a fool. One of probably the more famous verses out of chapter 10, when words are many, transgression is not lacking. Whoever restrains his lips is prudent. Probably one of the most notorious verses from Proverbs. One that's often taught to kids, especially back in the day where kids were supposed to be seen and not heard. Verse 19 was one of those key ones where words are many and transgression is not lacking. James makes the point in James chapter 3 and verse 2 that if you do not sin with your lips, you are a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. Matthew chapter 12, verses 36, verse 37, he tells us it will be judged for every idle word. That keeping a tight restraint on our lips is key when it comes to wisdom and righteousness. Remember, we've been dealing with this a lot here in chapter 10. What is it that your mouth does? What is it that your tongue says? And he makes the point very clearly that where words are not lacking, transgression is also not lacking. And if you restrain your lips, you are prudent. He then carries on this theme of the mouth in verse 20. The tongue of the righteous is choice silver, and the heart of the wicked is of little worth. The lips of the righteous feed many, but the fools die for lack of sense. The blessings of the Lord makes rich, and he adds no sorrow with it. All of these verses again kind of go together, that the tongue of the righteous is choice silver, and the lips of the righteous feed many. And while there is obviously senses of generosity that come forward in verse 21, primarily it is the lips that speak the wisdom or speak the truth of God that feeds other people the knowledge that they need. I think that's the primary thing he talks about. And he uses that in a very neat way in verse 21, that the lips of the righteous feed many, and the fool dies not for lack of bread, but for a lack of sense. So Solomon, some clever things that he's doing there with wordplay, and I want us to kind of pick up on some of those, because the more you pick up on those little clever hints, those little twist of phrases that he uses, the more they tend to stick in our memory. I don't know Hebrew. I would imagine that some of these tend to rhyme a bit more or tend to flow a bit better in Hebrew. Obviously, we're translating them into English. And so the more that you can pick up on those things, the more that you get to memorize them, and the more that they come to mind whenever they're needed. He then mentions in verse 23 that doing wrong is like a joke to a fool, but wisdom... Oh, I skipped a couple verses already, didn't I? I apologize. I skipped right over verses 8, 9, and 10. Because these verses are connected. Verse 8, the wise of heart will receive commandments, of the babbling of fool will come to ruin. And verse 10 is a connecting verse, because he mentions that same phrase, whoever winks the eye causes trouble, and a babbling fool will come to ruin. So those are the same phrasing there in verse 8 and in verse 10, and he combines those together. That in verse 10, that the winking of an eye is not that you're not allowed to wink. But the point being is that is a how they conduct business, how they there's a tendency whenever you fool somebody that you want to conspire with somebody and you wink at them, let them know that I got one over on them. That's kind of what he's dealing with there. It's not that all winking is bad, but that winking to over righteousness or over wickedness rather is a terrible thing that causes trouble, and the babbling fool will come to ruin. And so he then continues with that same theme over in verse 23 where we were at, that doing wrong is like a joke to a fool. Have you seen people just overcome with a fit of giggles or laughter over some bit of wrongdoing that they did, that they were overjoyed about it? He says here in verse 23 that wrongdoing is like a joke, but not to the righteous, not to the simple, but to the fool. But wisdom is a pleasure to a man of understanding. What is it that you take pleasure in? Do you take pleasure in doing wrong or watching other people do wrong? Or do you take pleasure in wisdom? Is this something that you enjoy? Verse 24. What the wicked dreads will come upon him, but the desires of the righteous will be granted. Now, compare that with verse 3. The Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but thwarts the craving of the wicked. Now, he turns that kind of on its head in verse 24, Not the cravings of the wicked, but what the wicked dread, that will come upon him. But the desires of the righteous will be granted. Now, the question comes up about this. It's similar to Matthew 7:7. Ask and you shall receive. Knock and the door will be opened to you. Seek and you will find. Well, what is it? Is that a free pass of whatever you want you're going to get, that you just have to wish to the universe and God will supply that to you? Or is he classifying the fact that because they're righteous, their desires are going to be of a certain quality, a certain characteristics, that those things are things that God is going to grant to them? I think it's the second one. James chapter 4 gives us a really good insight. James chapter 4 and in verse 3, James is criticizing some of the Christians there for not receiving the things that they pray for. It wasn't that they weren't praying, because here in verse 2 and verse 3, he says, you desire and you do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and you quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask, but you ask and do not receive, in verse 3, because you ask wrongly to spend it on your own passions. There is this a very important concept, a very important idea that he is combining here in Proverbs chapter 10, that James points out in James chapter 4, that Jesus is speaking of in Matthew chapter 7, that the desires that you have are not just happen to be the desires that you have, they give a really good indication of if you are righteous. When Jesus talks about that in Matthew chapter 7, he isn't giving a blank statement of anything that you ask. I really, really, really want that person to die. That's going to be granted to me because I asked really, really hard for it. I really want $1 million so that I can buy, a bunch of whatever in order to just fulfill my lust and my desires. I really want to go back to. We'll leave that there. What he's dealing with here is that the desires of the righteous will be granted. That your desires are going to be either down the line of the fool or down the line of the righteous. And he makes the point back in chapter 10 and verse 3 that God thwarts the craving of the wicked, but the desires of the righteous will be granted. That's what we're talking about. That your righteousness or your foolishness will affect your prayers. And the prayers that are asked wrongly to spend on your own passions and your own desires, James makes the point that those things are not going to come to pass. In fact, Solomon makes that point here in chapter 10 and verse 3, that God will thwart those cravings. But if you desire things from a righteous heart, those things will be granted. That's what we're dealing with. So it's not a blanket statement of, anything that a righteous person will desire, God grants. What he's saying is that if you are righteous, you will have desires that God will want to grant. And that's a very important difference. Verse 25, when the tempest passed, the wicked is no more, but the righteous is established forever. And I want us to consider this maybe in context of the old phrase that there's no atheist in a foxhole. That if you see someone in a pinch, most often they're going to pray. Prayer is a beautiful thing, and it's a mystery. And I have a hard time trying to teach on prayer. As C.S. Lewis said, I feel like I'm always a student of prayer and never a teacher of prayer. There is something innate in us, I believe, that calls out for us to call to our Creator in times of need. And you will find a lot of people who are in the hospital, and their desire is for you to come and pray with them. You'll find people who are in dire straits who want to pray to God and want help. They want to make large commitments of their life. And maybe you've known some of them. They've overdosed and they're coming around, and they make this large commitment that I will never, ever, ever, ever abandon God again. And then the question comes up here in verse 25. When the tempest passed, what happens? When the financial crisis is over, when the war is finished, when they're sent home from the hospital, what happens at that point in time? I had a study a little over a year ago with someone that was exactly the case. In the hospital, made this large commitment of I'm going to return to God, that I'm going to change my life around, that everything's going to be completely different, only for when the tempest was past, they were no more. In the sense that, that desire, that commitment, that strong will that they had to do something different with their life, that was no more. It was gone. But he mentions here that the righteous is established forever. There are some people who, when they go through the storm, they change, and they change forever. And the question comes up for us, what kind of commitments are we going to make? Are we going to make ones that are only in the tempest, or are we going to make commitments that establish us forever? It's an important thing to consider. Picking up from the theme of verse 4 and verse 5 of the slack hand and those who sleep in harvest. In verse 26, like vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so is the sluggard to those who send him. Not only is this obviously negative to you in verse 4 and verse 5, but also to any employer, anybody that you are going to represent, including family members, whatever the case may be. That it's like vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes. That's going to be both for employers to remember when they choose to send people out, and also for you as an employee of being what kind of employee are you going to be. Verse 27, he mentions here the fear of the Lord. This has been a kind of a constant theme throughout the book. The fear of the Lord, as we know from chapter 1, is the beginning of knowledge. But here it also prolongs life. But the years of the wicked will be short. And again, he's not only speaking of the idea that if you fear God, you will live longer, which there is some real, I want to say truth, because there's always truth to what God says, but there's an actuality to that, as we get over to Ephesians, where Paul mentions that those who honor father and mother it's the first command with a promise, they shall live long on the earth. There is a part of what he's dealing with here. But there's also a part of what Solomon deals with in Ecclesiastes, that for the righteous, the Lord occupies them and fills their days with joy, so that they don't feel like their life is lacking. But for the fool or for the wicked, their years are short. That's never enough for them. Hopefully there will be a time where we are more ready to go to home and be with the Lord, as Paul speaks of in Philippians, where we don't look back in this life and say, well, I need more of this life, but I'm ready to move on to my home with God. And I think part of that is what he's dealing with here, where the wicked long for more time here, fearing what is going to be in the future for them. Here in verse 28, the hope of the righteous brings joy, but the expectation of the wicked will perish. Again, falling off that same theme of verse 27 on into verse 28, that the hope of the righteous brings joy. What we look forward to, that should be a joyous thing. But the expectation of the wicked will perish. The way of the Lord is a stronghold to the blameless, but destruction to the evildoer. The same sun that melts butter also hardens clay. The same rain that came and saved Noah is the same rain that drowned the rest of the world. And there's a lot of people who feel that the way that God has prepared for them is nothing but destruction. It is to anybody who is wicked, but it's also salvation to anybody who would turn. So he mentions here that the righteous will never be removed, but the wicked will not dwell in the land. That goes back to one of the very first things that God gave them in Deuteronomy, that the righteous will dwell in the land. Deuteronomy chapter 6, he tells them to teach this diligently to their children and teach that to their children, so that the righteous may inherit the land. But he mentions here that the wicked will not dwell in the land, which is, again, sadly ironic that Solomon's the one who writes this, that his descendants are the ones who split the kingdom apart and begin that slow process of them actually losing the land. A sad state. We get back to the topic of the mouth here in verse 31. The mouth of the righteous brings forth wisdom, but the perverse tongue will be cut off. The question that comes up, what kind of mouth do we have? What kind of people are we? Are we individuals who bring forth wisdom, or are we people who speak perverse things? And he kind of lumps this in, kind of one or the other. Not a mostly this and sometimes that, but are you truly someone who is righteous with your mouth, or are you someone who is perverse and is going to be cut off? In verse 32, the lips of the righteous know what is acceptable, but the mouth of the wicked, what is perverse. And there's a lot of people who don't know what is acceptable to God. And he categorizes them here in verse 32 as wicked. The wicked know what is perverse, but the mouth of the righteous knows what is acceptable. And a lot of what he provides here is a lot of checks and balances for us to come along and say, okay, here's what he says is true. Now, where do I fit into that scenario? Am I one or am I the other? Sometimes we like to view ourselves as being mostly one and not the other. And he really asks us to self-examine here in the book of Proverbs. I have thoroughly enjoyed going through chapter 10 in preparation for tonight's class. I know that I did not do it nearly justice that it deserves. In a short time period, this is a book that is designed for you to go over and over again in your life and come back and revisit and memorize more and study more and pull more out of it. And so I know that just one simple class does not cover chapter 10 thoroughly. I hope that it has been somewhat beneficial. Lord willing, if we are not able to meet together in our building, we will try to get into chapter 11 next week. I realize that we could spend quite a bit of time going through the book of Proverbs. I don't know if we will get to do that in its full extent, but I hope that we get through a few chapters that we can help us to start on this path of wisdom, to pick up some of these ideas and to really self-examine along the path. So, Lord willing, chapter 11 next week, and I hope that you guys have a wonderful night, and Lord willing, we will see you Sunday. Have a good night.